Okay, I think we'll make a start as it's 2:35. So welcome and hello to everybody who's joining us from not just England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, but also Alaska, which is just wild to me. So a special shout out to Ingrid for joining us all the way from Alaska. Um, so I guess, yeah, hello and welcome to this like super exciting conversation with some of my personal favorite thinkers doing work on creative and transformative approaches to justice after gendered violence. Again, just for people that are just joining, we're using a webinar Zoom, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say hello. And if you have any specific questions that you'd like asked to any of the panelists, or you have and speakers, or if you have kind of general questions that you want asked that maybe you didn't ask in advance of this in the kind of Eventbrite section, just feel free to pop them in the Q&A section, and there's a Q&A option on your screen. So I can see, and I think we can all see from the amount of people here, but also from the number of people who signed up and the amount of questions that were submitted via the Eventbrite page, that there's just a massive hunger for approaches to justice for survivors that are far, far removed from the criminal legal system. And I think me and all of the people in this webinar today could agree that the reason for that is really simple, which is that many of us know to the core of our being that the criminal legal system only increases harm and violence to survivors, to folks with additional marginalizations, and also just increases the rippling violences that we see in the world that we live in. And many of us will know on some level that no amount of reform will ever make the system, the criminal legal system, better. And this is something that I really felt and saw in the earlier Vorg Research Network webinar earlier this month, which very much looked at the brokenness of the criminal legal system. And in the service that I used to work for, that Camila still works for, that a couple of other members of people on this call worked for, we used a phrase that you can't polish a turd. And it's something that I feel really, really strongly. And I'm sure that some of you joining us today will also. So the conversations that we hope to explore today, we hope will kind of offer some ways that we can go about obtaining justice or supporting survivors obtain justice in ways that are not only removed from the system, but also seek to dismantle it. And I know that for many of you, or some of you, that may, in joining us today, that may feel uncomfortable and scary, but I think I'm just going to ask you to all lean into some of that discomfort as much as possible today and trust the people on the call. I think on that regard, the people on this beautiful conversation today aren't going to offer us all the answers, and they may not offer us easy or straightforward solutions, and they also may not offer us or you ways or transformative approaches that kind of prevent any harm from happening. And there's this beautiful quote in a book called Beyond Survival, where from one of the authors, Edris Dixon, where they say we can't return people to their lives before trauma or violence, and that realization can just feel devastating. So I think just leaning into that discomfort as much as possible. And something that I also wanted to say before we begin and before I introduce each of the speakers in turn is that this talk isn't just a talk that's focused on transformative justice processes. And it was something that very much came up in the conversation, the questions that were being asked, kind of what does a transformative justice process look like, and so on and so forth. We're going to be talking about transformative and creative approaches to justice. So taking it away from that very narrow focus that transformative justice often is framed as something much bigger and much broader and much more exciting and beautiful. And that's why we've got such a variety of different experiences on this call, people with very different backgrounds. And that kind of approach to transformative justice is something that's more than just a process, builds on work by amazing writers and thinkers like Ruthie Gilmore and Rousseau, Sarah Lambour, who all talk about transformative justice as something bigger and more everyday. So how will this webinar conversation work? It's a little bit different from the other Vorg webinars if you've been to them. It's not so much a panel, more a conversation between the speakers that you see. Again, you can ask them specific questions if you have specific questions, and we'll try and pick up on them. I've tried to weave in as much of the questions or as many of the questions that were asked into the discussion that we're going to be having today. So first, to introduce each of our speakers, first we have Avia Sarah Day. Just quickly, would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to introduce yourselves? I'm happy
to introduce me, please.
So Avia Sarah Day is currently a lecturer in criminology at Birkbeck University of London, as well as an activist in the East End chapter of Sisters Uncut. Sisters Uncut is a national direct action collective fighting cuts to domestic violence services as well as state violence. Avia's PhD, which was entitled Partnerships Empower Domestic Violence, the Women's Sector and the Criminal Justice System, which I've read, it's incredible, applied an intersectional approach to women's sector partnerships with the criminal justice system, focusing specifically on gender, class, race, immigration status and disability, and her research interests are survivor criminalisation, transformative justice, and prison abolition. Next up, we have the phenomenal Camilla Tomlinson. Camilla is an experienced counsellor and psychotherapist working predominantly with women who have survived sexual violence. Her work embodies a clinical ethos that consciously works to create new creative ways of working that honour people's cultural, political identities, both past and present. She brings an intersectional approach to her therapeutic practice, working with the awareness of the impact of social and political systems of oppression on the mind, body, and spirit. Camilla has a particular interest in the critical examination of empowerment models used in clinical therapeutic practice, and I've spoken with Camilla about this, and her insight is so needed and important. And she advocates for the radical overhaul of the theories that inform mainstream mental health formulations and practices, bringing attention to outdated Eurocentric ideologies that fail to acknowledge that mental health and emotional well-being are significantly affected by systemic inequalities, trauma and oppression, particularly in Black, Brown and other marginalised communities. Then we have Melanie Brazel. Melanie Brazel is a transformative justice researcher and practitioner committed to community-based non-punitive responses to sexual and partner violence. Their participatory research and community collaborations are documented in the What Really Makes a Safe project, which I would really urge anyone interested in TEJ and transformative justice to look up. It's got a lot of beautiful resources on it. And the project looks transnationally at transformative justice for gender-based violence. And last but absolutely not least is Yara Rodriguez Fowler. Yara is a writer from South London, and her first novel, Stubborn Activist, tells a story about healing from sexual violence using prose, poetry, fragments, and English and Portuguese. And it's one of the best books I've read. It was longlisted for the Desmond Elliott and Dylan Thomas Prize, and Yara was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year 2019. She's writing her second novel now, and we're all very excited for it, for which she received, that was my dog, very sorry, which she received the Society of Authors John C. Lawrence Award and was shortlisted for the Eccles Centre and Hay Festival Writers Award. Yara worked with Shane and Level Up on projects supporting survivors of sexual violence, and is also a trustee for Latin American Women's Aid, an organisation that runs the only 2 refuges in Europe for and by Latin American women. So just such an exciting array of incredible people. And I guess the first question that I wanted to start us off with is I wanted to know a bit about people on this call's kind of own justice and healing frameworks that you bring into the work that you do. So that could be some of the skills that you use. And I wonder maybe if, Melanie, you could start us off by talking about some of the like transformative justice skills, because I know that there was a hunger for that in the questions.
Yeah, so hi everybody. So the question is my own frameworks, or okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I've really been brought up in the tradition of Black and women of color feminism, as well as like trans and queer feminisms. And I first learned about transformative justice and community accountability alternatives to the carceral system when I was working as an assistant at my college's sexual violence prevention and response office. And I had a very visionary boss who, Maura Barely, who's still in the anti-violence world, who put the work of Insight on my desk. And Insight is a US-based network of feminists of color against violence. And so what Black feminists and feminists of color taught me about justice is basically that, you know, we can't separate individual justice for situations of interpersonal violence from social justice for structures of violence like racism, transmisogyny, ableism, all of these interlocking oppressions. So, calling in organs of state violence like police and prisons to try to get individual justice ends up re-entrenching the cycle of violence in survivors' lives. And to quote Insight, they say the question is not should she call the police? The questions are, why is that her only option? And can we provide other options that will keep her truly safe? And another thing that my TJ forebears taught me is that I cannot do this work only from the neck up. So thinking about healing justice, and to paraphrase something I heard from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, that resistance is healing and healing is resistance, and that we have to heal cycles of trauma from oppression and violence that live inside our bodies. And I know, Camila, that's sort of your whole work, so I'll just kind of leave it there.
I guess, yeah, Camila, would you like to speak to some of those healing practices that maybe you have? In fact, I know probably by far the most knowledge and experience of all of some of the core.
There we go, unmute. Yeah, I think it's very much about sort of, I guess what's come up in my practice is very much, I guess, looking at how I see myself in the world and my experiences, and looking at what we have been taught within sort of psychotherapy, mental health, and those foundations which then impact how we feel we should relate to people in the therapeutic space. So I guess the creative ways have been very much about challenging, what we think we know, and also looking at, some of the more basic things in sort of the therapeutic relationships of power and differences. But I think when it comes to the actual work in the room, it becomes more than just a therapeutic relationship. It's that idea of, more than just empathy and compassion, but really understanding what those political and social issues that really, really sort of inform people's lives. And I think often those things are left outside of the therapy room, but also some of the policies and philosophies which a lot of organizations are founded on, and the lack of sort of radical critical thinking. So I think the moment that you kind of engage with the people that you're working with from a place of not always knowing and questioning that and bringing in some of the elements that are left outside of the therapy room, that's creative in its sense, in itself. That brings a whole different dimension to the work that we do. And I guess one of the experiences that, and the thing that you see happening often is a protection of clients when they come into the space, because there is, the idea that actually those other experiences aren't often even spoken about, outside of maybe their own social groups or relationships with other people that understand. So, there's definitely a, should I bring this? Can I bring this? Oh, I probably can't. So there's a huge barrier. So in being able to kind of challenge the notions of what it means to be a therapist, coming from a place of being ourselves in the room and being a bit more transparent and naming things a bit more, but also coming from a place of not knowing. Like, often we don't know everything. We don't know about, and I think there can be this idea that as therapists, we feel that we should know, and we can't say, actually, I don't know much about that. What does that feel like? What does that look like? And also the way that we look at trauma. I think trauma and harm can be seen in very specific ways. And I think that sometimes comes across in a lot of, sometimes even mainstream popular feminism of, we look at some harms, but we don't look at other harms. So we cannot take away from the understanding that the things that are replicated in society are going to be replicated in charitable organisations, and therefore going to be replicated in therapeutic practice. So anything that that starts to look outside of that is already creative and transformative.
I love the idea of not knowing, and I think that for me at least, it's a really important aspect of creative and more transformative approaches to justice. And what you were saying about kind of there often being too much protection, it made me actually think a lot of Avia's work around the ways in which there's this kind of it's not even protection. I mean, you'd absolutely be able to speak about this more than I am, Avia, but like the ways in which services kind of bubble wrap survivors sometimes. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to that, but also touching upon your own frameworks around justice and healing as well.
Yeah, so I have to apologise for all of the posters behind me. My brother's got sports science exam coming up, so there's loads of pictures of bones and stuff behind me. So yeah, I guess like I mean I came into this work because of my own experiences of domestic violence growing up and trauma, and you know, was a really big part of my daily upbringing. And you know, I'd spent time in a refuge as a kid. When I was really young, my best friend's mum was murdered by her dad, and it had an enormous impact on me, to the point where later on, when I left university, I really wanted to work in domestic violence. It was something that really stayed with me. It was something that I wanted to come back to. And I had all kinds of really like romantic ideas of working in a, you know, 1970s style refuge that, you know, would do loads of really transformative work, and it didn't really work out like that. And ended up actually working as a domestic violence advocate. And I don't know if people, you know, it seems to be quite a few IDVAs on the call, but for anyone who doesn't know, actually that model was brought over from the States, and is very criminal justice focused. And I wasn't someone who's particularly interested in the criminal justice system, but that seemed to be where a lot of the money was going. And I ended up working in a service that was, you know, not only working around criminal justice, but kind of was trying to encourage more survivors to go through the criminal justice system, to stick with the criminal justice system, to be witnesses in court, that kind of thing. So yeah, and you know, what I actually found was a lot of my the survivors I was working with were getting arrested, they were getting nicked. And that's kind of what inspired my research, because I was kind of wanted to understand a little bit of why that was. And you know, at that point I wasn't a prison abolitionist, I wasn't necessarily a you know, I was very critical of the criminal justice system, but I wouldn't quite say that my politics around that stuff had fully formulated, although everyone in my team who had to spend one day a week at the police station dreaded that and tried to, we all used to conspire to try and figure out ways to spend as little time at the police station as possible. But yeah, it was only later that I kind of, you know, through my research and through activism with Sisters Uncut, that I got exposed to ideas of alternatives. And you know, it's difficult because, you know, what Molly was saying around, you know, this massive push towards the criminal justice system and this kind of carceral feminist response to domestic violence that has become really the dominant response over the last sort of 20, 30 years in this country, and also lots of other countries like in the US as well. It's very difficult. It's becoming even more difficult to imagine any kind of alternative, because this is where the money is, this is where the funding is. You know, if you do have a domestic violence service, you know, and you're applying for funding, it's often coming from the criminal justice system. And this is how people, you know, this is how services are sustaining themselves. But, you know, through activism, you know, reading and getting exposed to, not only just through you know, understanding the theory behind that, but actually the practical responses to, you know, responding to violence and harm in our community. And I've learned loads about, you know, like the materials coming out of the Bay Area, POB mapping, and how we can think about the people in our lives that we can go to when we've experienced harm, but also the people that are going to hold us accountable, that are going to tell us how it is. You know, I can think of a few different people who, like, if I was to ask them, like, did I mess up, did I fuck up, they're going to give me a proper answer, and they're going to hold me accountable and start like figuring out, like, who those people are and how we can build those systems within our communities on a daily basis, not only when, you know, and I can speak a bit more about this later, not only when we fucked up, but also like on a daily basis. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, one of the examples that kind of springs to mind is like, you know, I've kind of been vaguely involved in accountability processes here and there, and probably, you know, varying degrees of success. And like, you know, no one, as people have said, no one's got all the answers. We can only do what we can do to put things in place to support survivors and do our best to try and shift things and to change things. But one example that was quite, as always kind of really intrigued me, was an accountability process that was run by the perpetrator's brother. And it was one of the more successful examples, I think. And I think part of the reason for that was because that person's brother happened to be also the person that was going to be the person that, you know, holds that person accountable. That wasn't going to let that person slip and slide out of responsibility, but also had an unconditional love for that person and wasn't going to run away and wasn't going to say, well, I've had enough of you, I'm going to leave it. And it's always got me thinking about how we can create that outside of our blood ties necessarily, how we can do that and create chosen family ties, like chosen community that are as strong as what our society says blood ties are supposed to be. Because I think in that, for me, is the key to accountability and transformative justice. I think that there's a reason why that's one of the only examples I can think of that has been vaguely successful at holding a perpetrator to account. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that's a coincidence. So yeah, those are the kind of ideas I've got bubbling around in my head at the moment.
Thank you. And there's so much in there that I want us to come back to, like, especially I want at some point in the next kind of 30 minutes or so, I want everyone to hear more about carceral feminism from you. And I want us to very much talk a bit more about pod mapping, and because I know that there'll be people in this webinar, people in the discussion who kind of don't know what that is. And I definitely want us to come back to that. But there was something that you said about the difficulty to imagine that makes me think a lot about maybe Yara and your kind of the way that you utilize imagination and kind of creativity specifically around your more transformative work practices. And I wonder if you can share them with us before we move on to those kind of more specific points from Avia.
Yeah, definitely. Before I start, my downstairs neighbour's having like a one-man rave, so if you can hear like the bass, that's what that is. Yeah, so basically what I do, I guess, is I'm like, I write fiction, but so my first novel, Stubborn Archivist, is kind of told in fragments and uses blank space and poetry, but in like a accessible way, not in a way that's one of those books that you have to like force yourself through, so it's easy to read. And the main arc of it is the protagonist on her kind of zigzagging healing journey from some sexual violence that she's experienced. And the kind of, I also didn't have the kind of frameworks and vocabulary that I do now, certainly around like transformative justice or abolition when I was writing. But what I did have in my mind, and that's kind of led to where my practice is now with all of this new information, is the idea, and I guess my background was much more in like literary studies and trauma studies and how is it that we represent violence. So I was kind of thinking about how can I create a text that's like survivor centered with the kind of proviso that like all survivors might want to read all kinds of things or whatever, not want to read at all. But what I mean by that is there's no rape scene, there's no kind of like abuse scenes. It's not about convincing the reader that sexual assault happens within relationships or that when it happens it's really bad. It's not about that. That's kind of taken for granted. Well, not taken for granted, but it's not, I'm not trying to convince anyone. You kind of believe her that it happened. And what you see instead is kind of the protagonist's experience of healing in its all of its silliness and awkwardness, as well as its pain and alienation from the body. And the arc of the book, insofar as it has an arc, kind of leaves you in a place where you see her connected to her body, experiencing joy, but not like cured. So whoever mentioned before, like, you can't take back the trauma. It's not at all promising to do that. So in that was how I tried to make it kind of survivor centered, I guess. And like, Me Too happened after I was writing, but it's different to kind of all of this onslaught of accounts of violence. And but the other thing I wanted to do in that book is that and part of this is it not having a clear beginning and end, and healing being a zigzag and so on. But I also, there's a lot of intergenerational stories that are told in the book. So it's half here and half in Brazil, which is the same background as my family. And so it talks about the young woman being hypersexualized and exoticized for being Brazilian in the UK. But it also talks about, and she's white, but it also talks about ancestrally the violence that, for example, there's a bedtime story her grandmother tells her where one of her ancestors like kidnaps and presumably sexually assaults an indigenous woman. And we also see the race and class dynamics between her family in Brazil and, like, for example, the woman who works for her grandma's family. So we hear her mother's stories of the dictatorship in Brazil. So what I was trying to do there is say, we hear very little about the ex-boyfriend, the perpetrator, actually. So what I was trying to say there is, again, this came up earlier, it's not really about, it is very personal, the story, but the way I'm encouraging the reader to think about harm and violence isn't by focusing on the agency of the perpetrator or how like evil he is or whatever. He's like a super average blank canvas kind of guy, but instead saying, how does even this middle-class white girl in England get hypersexualized and exoticized? Think how big and blunt the weapon of settler colonialism is and imperialism, that even that is happening. And I guess looking back now, I would say that is a way that I'm trying to get the reader to think in a more transformational way about social justice, rather than just focusing on the interpersonal and like the moment of violence. And I guess that's where my work is going now, much more about like, how can I use my writing to create like these spaces of utopia or resistance, or say like, look how close we have come to big change before. So I'm writing a lot about the resistance to the dictatorship in Brazil. And another piece of work I'm doing with this amazing filmmaker called Jay Jackson, and Molly, you worked on this project as well, is it gathered testimonies, like 40,000 words of testimony from survivors, and we've sort of fictionalized it and we've written a script for a film. And we're thinking a lot about that as a space where different fantasies can exist. So revenge fantasy can exist in the film, but or the character can engage in that fantasy, and you're allowed to want that. Whether you should do it is a different thing entirely. But it's also space to show what might happen if she goes to the police, and then what we kind of want the audience to feel is like relief that she doesn't, because it kind of does show how it can just be another trauma. But also, like, it's set in a toilet, so we wanted to show this woman and her friend, like that being maybe the community being the safety and the place for like justice, if you can call it that.
Thanks so much, Yara. There was, again, I think there's going to be so much in everything that everybody says, and I think everyone here is just so lucky to be learning from all of you. The things that I was like picking up of like the role of fantasy, like punitive fantasy, but also joy, and what Avia was saying about the importance of love. And it makes me think about like what does creative and transformative justice look like to us, while I'm also holding like what you said, Yara, about how in your book in Stubborn Archivist, the harm doer is at the sideline, and if we're doing accountability practices, which I know that some of us in the call will have experience of doing, that's not always the case. And like Camila, from your experience, the survivor is very much at the center. And I know that there were questions from people through the Eventbrite of kind of how can we where do we direct our energy when we're doing this transformative and creative work? Is it a misdirection of our energy to be focusing on the harm doer? Where do we put that, and what do we do when the survivor wants punitivity, when actually we know that, as someone shared in the chat box, is the system broken, or is it doing exactly what it's meant to do? And we know that the system doesn't work, and actually, like I said at the start, just fosters further harm. And I know that I've just spoken a lot of things at you, but I'm wondering if any of you want to pull on any of those strands and speak through some of your ideas on the like different balancings of energy around harm doer and survivor, and what we do with survivor centered when those desires and fantasies are punitive, and like what that justice looks like.
Yeah, I don't mind touching on that a bit. I think, the reality is that when you're working, when I'm working with survivors, most of the time they're not going to get that need met through the justice system, simply because I don't even know what the percentage is in terms of the, numbers of harm doers or perpetrators are not in that system. So the reality is that we're working with that and that disappointment or that anger and frustration in the room anyway. And I think that leads to, how the creative work then actually develops. So it's kind of like, well, actually, when that isn't an option and it's not happening, what does that mean for you? Where do we go from there? And I think that's the important thing of sort of critically looking at ideas in terms of sort of empowerment, the idea of how do you empower an individual within the systems that we live in. And I think that's what sort of starts to get quite tricky within some of the philosophies or foundations which some organisations sort of base their workings off, is the idea that it's kind of like all about the individual, and we're not looking at what happens outside of the room. Can we really, and the fact that, it's looking at, survivors actually as disempowered. It's like, where does this come from? Why are we saying that there are these disempowered women that need to come into these organizations, and we need to help them be where does this all come from? Right? So it's kind of like, well, what that really looks like is kind of starting to dismantle the ideas and the foundations of where empowerment comes from, and how it doesn't look at what's politically going on, what's socially going on. And I think that's super creative in itself. So, we're really having to challenge what we think we already know about empowerment, about disempowerment, and about a system that is not supporting anyway, but also why we're not, as organisations, as individuals, as speaking from a space, as somebody that's a member of a community, but also we're not looking outside the box. We're not challenging that anyway. It's not, where it's also deep seated in the foundations of how we think we're supposed to move forward. And yeah, so I think that's a huge direction that needs to be gone in, I think. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, can I come in on that?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, I think it's something that I have oscillated on, the idea of what it means to be survivor-led for years, really, and what it means in terms of our collective response to violence. And I think, when we're thinking about punitive or carceral responses, actually the carceral feminist responses that we have at the moment are not necessarily not survivor-led. There are some survivors who that is the response they want to go with, and largely they tend to be white and middle class cis women who have that response, and that's what makes them feel safe. They want to be able to rely on those institutions because they think that that's safety within those institutions is a possibility for them, and that is a form of they are being survivor-led in that response. And the same goes for for cis women who seem to think that banning trans people from their spaces will make them feel safe, and it's because some of them are survivors and they feel that that's going to help them. So similarly, I would often respond to that, this idea that a penis being in the same space as you is an inherent threat, with some work I actually did with a survivor back when I was an IDSVA, an independent domestic and sexual violence advocate, with a young survivor who it was one of these quite high profile cases, because it was all over the newspapers as Asian grooming gangs, and she wasn't white herself, but she disclosed to me that actually since what happened to her, she felt really uncomfortable being in South Asian areas, and she felt that this was something that had been heightened through the press attention that had happened in her case, and it wasn't something that she felt comfortable with, and it felt difficult for her to be able to admit that to me. And at that point, it wasn't necessarily something we could go into, but it was something that she really wanted to, at some point later down the line when she felt like she could, that she wanted to change. Now, the responses we have as survivors, around what does and doesn't make us safe, sometimes are productive and sometimes aren't. And sometimes there's something that we feel like is something worth pursuing, and sometimes it can be really destructive. So I kind of think it's really important to think about, yes, survivors need to be central, but I think an individualistic idea of what survivor-led means is a very liberal one. It's a very individualistic one, because it needs to be balanced against what the needs of the community is, and whether or not what that person wants is going to harm the community. To have a racist response, which is, to be honest, the way that the press responds to violence and violence against women, it's not surprising that some survivors are going to end up having a response like that. But that doesn't mean that can't change. That doesn't mean that you have to stay with that. It doesn't mean that women who feel threatened by a trans person being in their space, that it's always going to be like that, So I definitely think it is possible, and there's some work that I did with that young survivor, and with many survivors were able to get through that process, and were able to deconstruct their own responses, and to situate it within the systemic sort of racism and violence that's going on. So I think that is a collective response to be there for survivors through that process. I think we need to have, when I talk about safe spaces where survivors can share this and be supported through it, and aren't going to be judged, but actually be supported. So yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's possible to do that, but it's not just an individualistic response to survivors. It needs to be an iterative one between the collective and between the survivor, for me.
Thanks, Avia. And hearing you speak, I'm thinking of the differences between survivor-led and also survivor-centered, which we have in transformative justice practices, where we're not just being unequivocally led by what someone wants, but we're really interrogating the differences between what they need and what they want. And I was also thinking about kind of that pull that exists within all of us, regardless of our socioeconomic, racialized background and our gender identity, about kind of that pull to punish, and the punitive pull, and how it requires a lot of deep politicization and deep political work for us to overcome that. I'm sure none of us in the call were abolitionists and into transformative justice when we started doing this work. It's been work, and that politicization piece around kind of how we share and how we work, and what is something that kind of particularly Black queer feminist writers have been talking about for decades and decades. I'm super interested in that role of justice as fantasy as well, and around like what we can do with punitive fantasies. And I don't know if that's something that either you, Melanie, or Yara can speak to, because I think there's something in when we're doing this creative and transformative work with survivors, like really identifying what that punitive fantasy, that punitive one is, and doing work with it, either through like more creative tools like writing. Like I've used free writing with in transformative justice processes before, and it's so powerful. So yeah, I don't know if either of you would like to come in there.
I can say something briefly. I wasn't planning on getting too personal on this call, but I'm actually like, I'm a survivor who's went through a failed accountability process, and I can't help but think about, let me say, like, failed in some regards, like failed in terms of accountability from the person who caused me harm. But in other regards, the support I received was amazing. And I'm just thinking about, Avia, what you're saying about like expanding beyond the individualization, and actually having a community of supporters around me allowed my very fractured mind to like give each voice inside of me and each need inside of me like a different person in the room that could give voice to that thing that I needed. And so actually the conflicts that were happening in my head could then happen as conversations in the circle, in the space. And I could actually like tag people and be like, hey, I need you to like hold on to the humanity of the person that harmed me. Like, please remind me when I lose it. Right. And you know, it's so interesting because I think when we're talking about what survivors like how to handle punitive wishes and desires, I think a lot about, I don't know who said this, I can't remember anymore, but the difference between loyalty and solidarity is something that I think about a lot. So like, there are times in my life where I just want to go to people and I just want them to say, you're so right, that's so fucked up, and cheerlead for me. And then I also need moments in my life where people are going to hold me to my values and be like, I see the pain that you're in, and I want to ask this question of your analysis of the situation. Have you thought about this element? Can you take a step back? What from your own past experiences is this re-stimulating for you and reminding you of? And so I just think about how when you're in a space, when I was in that space with a group of supporters, there was room for all of that. And it didn't have to all be crowded into my own head. And, you know, and then figuring out how you go from that conversation to action is like a whole other kind of complicated story, I think. Figuring out like, of all the different stories in the room, what are the ones that we can actually like, how can we take action on these things in the outside world beyond this space? So yeah, that's what I can contribute for now to that question.
Thank you. Yara, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, again, I don't have an answer, I guess. But yeah, I think particularly with the film that I've been working on with Jade, one of the responses that we got back did involve a revenge fantasy that was very clearly a fantasy rather than like a plan. And we did want to include it near the start of the film, so it's not sort of where we leave people narratively. I guess to show that that can be part of processing stuff, is having that desire. And actually part of how I think about this, and that it's okay to give ourselves for the desire, is that I was at a talk like a year ago where Avia was on the panel, and Avia said something like, if you feel some kind of way about your perpetrator, that's okay. And I was just like, it is okay. And like, that's what I was sort of holding on to when we were writing the script. So we kind of wanted to give space to that, without suggesting like vigilante, you know, whatever, which obviously isn't, you know, I mean, well, for some very powerful people it can be, but for most survivors isn't. So again, like, we haven't made the film yet, we haven't released it, so it's still something we're working on, but that was kind of how I was thinking about that. And then in terms of creativity, again, like I'm not I just know about my own creative practice, but certainly something that comes up a lot in writings around violence is, and this probably is related to what you were saying about like free writing exercises and stuff. But yeah, having a space where you feel that you can have narrative control over what happened or who you are or your body, I think can be very powerful. Yeah.
So powerful, and I'm sure everyone in this space can attest to that as well from doing various different pieces of work. Camilla, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just feel like that's really important, and I think, you know, the therapeutic space should be a place where you can, and it does, we do work in that way sometimes with clients, but I also think that there is that fear of things that are different, or if a client brings something that is really about what they would really like to do to their perpetrator, that they could be like, oh my God, you know, is harm going to be done? Do I need to call somebody? Do I need to report them? And that can often be the place to go, because there isn't that sort of like really, like that really open sort of like, okay, this is what's coming up for you. Can we talk about this? Okay, let me just check. You know, is this a fantasy or is this something, you know, and that's the reality of having uncomfortable conversations. And it can start there, and, you know, and whether it is working through writing that out or just giving the client space to really act out these things that are in their heads anyway, in the therapy, in the room, and that can be so powerful in terms of healing and moving forward.
Absolutely. Like what you've just said, alongside comments made by everyone else up to this point in that like last round, who am I? The last bit of the discussion makes me think of like, and I know that there are lots of practitioners in the call, so this may, you know, I'm going to ask everyone to lean into some discomfort some more, but I'm wondering like what we think about the role of services in doing this transformative justice work, especially when, if we're holding what Avia said earlier about that enmeshment between the criminal legal system and frontline services, kind of like what is the role that we think transformative justice, creative justice can be played by frontline services, and maybe like we want to do some imagination in this space about like what those services even look like. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, again, something I'm thinking about a lot recently, and I guess one thing that kind of springs to mind is sorry, that's my emails. That kind of springs to mind is you know, the more I've read about like how we've got to where we are now in terms of our like responses to violence in our community, the more I think it's kind of important to move away from service, I suppose, to like this professionalized idea of you know, a service that is, you know, with professionals who provide a particular service to people in the community, and hopefully once they've done that, they can get on their way and become fully functioning members of society. And sort of more towards like what kind of spaces I suppose we can create where transformative work can happen, and it doesn't have to be funded, or it can be funded, but like whatever that is. Because I think, you know, looking at the history of like when, you know, feminists were setting up the first refuges in squats, to all the way down the line now to these big NGOs, which, and the state has effectively co-opted a lot of that work and has taken it and taken a lot of the radicalism out of it, and funded it and turned it back to us as something that is barely recognizable in many ways. So I kind of think, for me personally, I think, you know, when it's like the kind of work we're doing, I think it's important to start thinking about ways that we can deprofessionalize, I think that's really, really important. And, you know, what I'm thinking about at the moment in terms of, you know, I haven't really thought, you know, I haven't really necessarily got an idea of what that's going to look like, but I've become more and more inspired by examples of where that's happened in the past, like I was talking about the domestic violence services, not services, or domestic violence refuges that were set up in squats where survivors supported each other through mutual aid, things like that. Also, you know, today there are examples. So I've been working with Sister Space, which is through my work with Sisters Uncut. and they are the only domestic violence service or space, if you will, for African and Caribbean heritage women in London. And they've kind of been faced with a lot of bullshit from Hackney Council around their premises, around their safety, and have had an ongoing fight. But one of the things that's really interesting is, like, not only are they up for the fight, are they up for sticking up for survivors, are they up for fighting the state when the state isn't going to offer them safety? You know, they have created a space that isn't professionalized. It's like, you know, I've been working domestic violence for like 10 years and I've never seen a space like it. And at one of the protests that we did against Hackney Council with their treatment of Sister Space, the police tried to arrest someone, and it was a white woman, and you know, Sister Space got in the road and stopped the police basically from arresting this person. And the CEO said, everyone get in the road. And the police basically couldn't drive down the road to get this person. That person got away. And I'm thinking, how many so-called CEOs of domestic violence services do I know who will get people to lie in the road to stop someone from being arrested, to stop a vulnerable person from being arrested? And yeah, I just kind of thought, wow. And this is what the freedom you get when you decide that you're not going to be the handmaiden of the state, when you're going to stick up for survivors and say, no, it's not good enough, and we'll rely on the community. And the community has, you know, donated money and been out to support that. And I think that's the direction we need to go in when we're thinking about how we're going to create those spaces that does real transformative justice work. We need to turn away from the state and its techniques to co-opt our work and look to the community to fund us, to provide those spaces, to do that work. And you know, I've become more and more inspired that that is actually possible, and what is possible when you're working in that space and you're not beholden to the state is that you can stick up for each other and you can save each other. So yeah.
100% agree, you know, and it's really, really difficult to work with some third sector organisations that have that sort of neoliberal idea of individualism, you know, when you're actually perpetuating a lot of harm that we're trying to fight against anyway. You know, so, you know, it's kind of like you're re-traumatizing workers, you know, then how does that impact client work? You know, so you can advocate and really try and fight against that, but actually it's really, really exhausting. So really sort of really second whatever you were saying about being able to collectivize, find that energy to move things forward, and really challenge how, you know, sort of like capitalism and imperialism and those elements have intertwined their way into some of these third sector organizations and are therefore preventing transformative and creative work from happening, and further exhausting staff and really, you know, and that also that idea of respectability, you know, and who can work with who and how you should work and how and what you can't say and what you can say and what you can and can't challenge, is very much alive at the moment in so many spaces. Yeah.
I wonder, Camilla, could you talk to us a bit about any knowledge that you have around the current unionising that's going on? Because to me that seems like something that very much speaks to kind of the creative and transformative types of justice work in a different setting.
Yeah, God, hadn't really thought about that as much, but yeah, it's really, I guess it's what it does is it really highlights the struggle. So, you know, you've got people and workers within the rural sector who have unionised to kind of sort of bring up and really highlight some of the issues that are going on, and I guess it's kind of how the pushback against that is really, really big, and, you know, quite exhausting, but it really gives an idea to some of the I guess what the issues are I would say, with I guess popular mainstream liberal feminism, and its inability to really look at some of the intertwinings of capitalism and imperialism in its in a way that it's working, and that, yeah, I think unions are the collective unions are really trying to work in a way that is more transformative and to challenge and to be more radical, but actually it's really quite exhausting. So it's really, it's refreshing to hear about the support for Sisters Uncut, but it feels like so many of these transformative ways of working that are trying to happen are happening in a really small space, and people really don't feel like they have the voices and enough support to move forward. So I think that's why it's really important to have these sort of conversations. And I think also that kind of really links to what Avi was saying about the need to sort of move out of trying to change a lot sometimes within these systems, because it's not happening. The you know, the structures, the where the power is, the, you know, the abilities to be able to, you know, silence people, sack people is, you know, so it's taking it outside of that, you know, because it's exhausting. You can't fight within that system. And I think that's also something that's quite apparent when we look at where we are today and we look at histories of revolution, and, you know, people taking to the streets, or, you know, people really being collective, whereas I think there is sort of like it feels like a sense of indoctrination when you know, you kind of feel like, you know, you believe so much in what you've been taught or what's been said, so there's not enough critical thinking. So I think, you know, education is really, really important. You know, something that, you know, I would consider myself quite a critical thinker, you know, someone that thinks outside the box. But all through sort of my training, you know, there was never we never looked at, or any philosophers that were Black or of colour, never once came up, not one book, not anything. And I'd never questioned it for 10 years, never until recently. I was like, oh, actually. So that, you know, there's a real foundation that needs to be challenged. And saying that, I'm going to be on one of your courses, Avia, next year at Birkbeck. So because of that, you know, I was just like, you know what, you know, I don't know enough. You know, I know what I know. So it's really, there is so much that needs to be stripped back from an educational perspective, even, you know, to stop that, actually the harm being perpetuated because of lack of education.
I mean, what I'm hearing, and something that I was hearing, at least from when you were speaking, is that idea of the expert and the harms that expert culture can foster, and not just experts of professionals, but also like unequivocally seeing survivors as experts who we shouldn't be engaging with, and seeing as people who are complex. And we had a question come in who wanted us to kind of expand a bit more on how we can, this is the way that it's been framed, deconstruct and evaluate and challenge survivor responses without devaluing their feelings and perceptions of threat. And I wonder if that's something that anyone feels able to speak to, because it feels like a really important kind of thing for us to be exploring when we're doing this work about creative work and transformative work, of like being alongside the person who has the experience of violence, and also being able to be alongside them in a critical and caring way. And I know that, Melanie, you've got a lot of experience of doing this transformative justice work, but I don't want to call on you if it's not a question that you aren't in the space to answer.
No, I'm happy to answer it. Just my internet got a little weird in the last second. So I'm like, not sure what the question is, but I'll go for it. Is this specifically about addressing the complexities of survivors' needs, or? Okay. I did want to say, if it's okay to add something to the last conversation, because I just really appreciated what both Camila and Avia were saying. And I just also wanted to kind of throw my hat in there to like make a call for us to become a movement again. and to really start getting radical in the sense of getting to the roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem are like systems of power. So getting away from that liberal framework that hasn't served us, and being willing to go like really deep and broad in what we're demanding. And I like that revolution, or the revolutionary spirit, was kind of like called into the space in that regard. But I also really want to lift up the work of API Chaya, because I think API Chaya is an organization in Seattle that addresses gender-based violence in South Asian, Pacific Islander, and just other broader immigrant communities. And they have developed a model that I think is amazing, that can be done within service organizations. And so what they did, they launched a program, I think it was last year, and Seattle and API Chaya have been like really amazing sources of transformative justice experimentation and wisdom for me and for a lot of people. So they started a program a year ago called Community Solutions, where they train up, they give like a 45-hour training to a cohort of 15 community members. And basically those community members are supported through mentorship from like older experienced accountability facilitator people who've, you know, been at the forefront of doing this work for a long time. And what happens is that API Chaya, then when they get cases of survivors who are like, I think I want to do a process, they can refer those survivors out to these community members who are like, I'm willing to hold and facilitate processes. And what I really love about this model is that, you know, the mentors are paid, the cohort is paid, so people are being resourced to do this work, but they're not being professionalized. So, you know, we've seen how professionalization kills social movements. The anti-violence sector, I think, is like a testament to that. And, you know, I think there's this desire in API Chaya's program of like, let's value community wisdom. Let's not see this as service work, but as like radical community building and community care and work that everybody needs to do. And so I talk about this in my work as an example of like scaling out instead of scaling up. So like we need more, we know that we need more, right? But instead of kind of consolidating into one big credentialing institution that concentrates power, how do we keep it grassroots and humble and allow it to spread in a rhizomatic way? And I think that they've developed a really great model for that. So I just wanted to put that in there. I don't think I answered your question, I'm sorry.
Oh my God, you totally answered my question and more. Avia, you said that you wanted to answer Ruth's question, the point which actually I think really leads us into this kind of questioning the role of the state. And you, Melanie, you were saying about that we need to be like looking at the roots of systems of power. And in the Q&A, Ruth said that, and there's another question from V about like, do we think decriminalizing domestic violence might encourage the movement towards new realities of justice and healing? And also like this desire to hold the state to account regarding violence against women and girls comes about because of the limited resources, exhaustion, etc. of activists, and the moral argument that the state has a responsibility for all citizens. And I guess with those two questions from two people in this webinar, I'd like us to start to think about like, what is the role of the state when we're doing this creative and transformative justice work?
So, yeah, really important points, and really important point, Ruth, asking around, yeah, holding the state to account. And I think, yeah, from what like the bits of research I've done, and like I was involved like a couple of years ago in an oral history project, talking to the people who set up some of the first refuges in the 70s. And it was quite interesting hearing about like the rationale of how things happened and why they happened and why they ended up taking money from the state and things like that. And actually that, you know, and from what I understand, there actually wasn't necessarily broad agreement about that. There was really big disagreement about what relationship feminists and people involved in the anti-violence movement should have with the state, and whether they should invest with the state and rely on the state or hold the state to account, and whether it was the state's responsibility to respond to violence and to fund refuges and to fund services, or whether actually the state was the root of violence. You know, and actually eventually it was the former that kind of won that argument in terms of the response and what happened next. But, you know, a lot of the people that I spoke to were very reflective over that, and very reflective over what cost it was to accept money from the state to sustain themselves. And obviously, you know, running a refuge out of a squat for years, having, you know, been involved in the East End Sisters Uncut occupation of a council flat for just 3 months, it's fucking knackering. You know, I can't imagine what people must have been going through trying to hold those spaces together for years without a great deal of money. And so my heart completely goes out to those people, and I'm totally inspired by the work that they did. But a lot of the people I spoke to said that they had really big regrets about the decisions that were taken at the time, and whether or not there could have been another way, because, you know, where we are now has a lot to do with, you know, the state, you know, the way in which, you know, the state's funding has come with an enormous amount of caveats. You know, we've gone from having these refuges in squats where survivors supported each other through mutual aid and where no one was turned away. And obviously that did mean a lot of overcrowding and mattresses snaking up the walls, basically, to 200 women being turned away because of the way the state dictates the terms of their funding, or people with no recourse to public funds, migrant women being refused services all over the country, and not only refused services, but basically being grassed up by services, by being informed on to the state, because that's a part of the funding, or, you know, things like that. And if we're going to have a movement, an anti-violence movement that is genuinely responding to violence and to all forms of violence towards all kinds of people, then the state is never really going to allow us to do that. It's always going to dictate terms, and we're always going to be on the back foot. So I do think it's important, I think, to think of ways to fund what we're doing outside of that. Melanie mentioned Insight. Insight wrote a really amazing book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that talks about a lot of these issues and starts to imagine ways outside of the state. And actually, to be honest, in some ways we're in a difficult position in the United Kingdom, because we've had the welfare state, and it might be dwindling now, but it seems to be harder for us because we have this expectation. You know, we've got the NHS, we've got councils that fund these things. It's much harder to imagine, because we've had it for such a long time, what a service or what a space would look like without state funding. But you know, for me, and I think, you know, because, you know, look up to Angela Davis a lot, and, you know, she basically says that actually the root of the violence that happens between us and interpersonally, it comes from the state. It comes from the state's power and violence that it wields. We are reflecting what the state does to us and what it does overseas, and so, you know, if we want to get away from that, we need to move away from the state and start imagining a different way of resourcing our movement.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to come in and like reflect how important I felt it was to hear that, but also like reflect some of the discomfort that maybe some people listening might feel, because like we're all so used to fighting austerity. And I've been in, and because I'm on the board of Lawa, which is this little service that's grown a bit now. It's 2 refuges. It was 1. Like the battle to ring fence funding, obviously, like from Sisters Uncut, like the battle for us has always been protect our government funding. We deserve government funding. But like what you're saying is so true. So like, dear government, please fund us so we can continue spending lots of money fighting the Home Office, which is also part of the government. So just to reflect back to you, like it seems almost unimaginable that our demand would be not to be funded by the government, but to also just like pause and be like, okay, we want our council to fund us, but like we're also fighting the council all the time on the phones. And like, yeah, it's only recently, like it's been really like, because you're always beholden to your funders and to the promise of state funding. You are forced into respectability and like liberalism, and like always the workers are on short-term contracts, and you're just reproducing. It's very hard not to reproduce like the structures and the harm as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go now. So
Oh, thank you so much, Avia.
another meeting, but thank you so much, and for everyone, and for yeah, it was great to hear from you all and from people's questions as well. So bye everyone.
Bye, Avia. What Yara just said made me think about that question earlier about like how we direct our energies as people that are doing this creative and transformative justice work. And there was that question that we brushed upon earlier about like, do we put all of our energy into kind of working with the harm doer? Do we put all of our energy into working with the survivor? How do we balance that energy when actually, so at the moment when we do frontline work or any type of support work or any type of work within a third sector charity organization, so much of that energy is automatically being taken to fighting the state. And I think that there's a real question for us to all be sitting with, an uncomfortable question, like you said, Yara, about what do we do now and where do we go from here? And where do we put those energies? And it is hard. And I know that there will be lots of people on this webinar today that won't ever want to work with harm doers. And I'm wondering if anyone feels able to speak to that tension of like never wanting to work with harm doers, but also knowing deep in our souls that actually doing some of that work, directing some of our energies there is so important.
I mean, and it has to be, because none of us live in isolation, right? And I guess it's really having that awareness that sometimes it doesn't even come up as a possibility. So we're not, for some organizations, for some individuals, there's not even that sort of the possibility. So I mean, starting from that place, I think is really important. Because there isn't, well, what does a future look like without working with harm doers? But it's also this idea that, you know, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable conversation. But the thing is that there are so many different types of harm. You know, we talk about state harm and it's huge, and, you know, so, you know, it has to start somewhere. And I think just to kind of touch on something that was kind of in a question that was brought up with how do we work with survivors that sort of want to go down sort of the traditional justice route, right? And I think that there is something about knowing that when you're working with survivors, you're holding that space for where they're at. And I think, and one, we just need to start having these conversations within our practices. But secondly, it's sort of being aware that there are alternative ways of working for ourselves as practitioners, because we're working for a space where that's not actually widely spread as it should be. So it's kind of not the fact that we have to jump in straight away and be like, hold on, did you know that, you know, it doesn't need to be that, because actually we're holding that space. And if you're working in a really open, transparent way, you will see that will sort of come out as it does. You know, for me, practicing for a while without this understanding and knowledge, you know, as I said, it kind of like in the beginning, you begin to work with the realities of that's not a reality, or you know, as wide as it should be. So actually, what else happens? And, you know, and also that a lot of survivors, you know, when it's, you know, they're going through that process for themselves, it can be very much about, actually, I don't want this to happen to anyone else, you know. So, you know, it's providing a space where we can work with different elements of what people bring, but primarily holding that space for them, and knowing that the abolition work and working outside of that can be something so wide, but in our practices, looking at actually what survivors need, rather than having to sort of place our politics or what we socially believe on them while they're going through that journey. So I think it's a really delicate space to have, but actually maybe the conversation is more wider for practitioners and organisations who are not having those conversations and pretending that they're not conversations that can be had, is what I think is kind of really, really important at the moment. And I can't remember the question before I decided to take it back. So I'm going to give it back to you, Molly.
No, again, I think everyone is perfectly answering and all of the answers are all perfect. All of the detours and the tangents, they're bringing us to places. There have been some comments in the chat box about like different services working with harm doers, and I wonder if there's anybody that would like to speak to that, about how, like, and it's something that I have thoughts around, about the fact that often we put harm doers over here and we put survivors over here, and I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that, the kind of othering.
Yeah, I can say a little bit. It's so delicate, right? I mean, I feel like in some ways the work, I always come back to Insight and Communities Against Rape and Abuse have this model of community accountability as having 4 parts. So it's like changing community values and practices, changing the structural conditions that make violence possible, which is also state violence, as we've talked about so much today, survivor self-determination and support, and accountability and transformation for people who cause harm. And I like to put that in perspective, because a lot of times some people do transformative justice interventions and they don't touch at all the people who caused harm. They decide that they don't have the resources or the capacities for that, and that's totally fine, right? Or they might do like harm reduction work around that person, but not actually directly engage them. So I think it's important to like keep all the pieces in mind, because I have the feeling with transformative justice, I've seen people tend to focus on that piece. And that's the piece, in some ways, that's the hardest piece of the puzzle. It's the one we figured out the least. It's the one where the most like pain and harm is still happening. And so sometimes I just want to zoom out and be like, we can still be successful even if we don't work with those folks. And at the same time, I want to break down, I think that like carceral feminism and the carceral system operate on this rigid, moralistic, individualized binary of perpetrator and survivor. And, the whole carceral system is about separation and isolation. Like, so we have to keep these people apart. We put the perpetrator in prison. We put the survivor in a women's shelter or refuge, which is also not always the place that survivors want to be, is disconnected from their community, for instance. So I think something that when we start to like look intersectionally and look at not just interpersonal, but other layers of institutional and structural violence, we just zoom out and we recognize that like lots of people are survivors of lots of different things. And we have to find a way to hold that doesn't put those things into competition, nor does it like dilute and water down the situation at hand that we're trying to address, right? Where there's a concrete case of violence where somebody committed violence against someone else. So we have to hold that like people who cause harm have themselves experienced harm and trauma. We also have to hold Connie Burke and Shannon Perez Darby and other people from the Northwest Network in Seattle write so beautifully about how we have to address the fact that survivors also use violence to survive, to resist, collateral damage to their loved ones, and that we have to live with that. And when we don't confront that, and we're not honest about that, we uphold the fantasy of the perfect survivor that no one can live up to. It's already a very racialized image. It's inaccessible to the vast number of survivors and very many marginalized survivors. So part of it is just kind of breaking down that binary, understanding that sometimes that binary is very necessary for our assessment process, but that we can't stamp people with these identities, right? These are behaviors, and behaviors can change, right? An identity, we don't tend to think of that as something that's malleable and can change. So, I mean, I think there's a whole other conversation to be had about how we get people to change their behaviors. And that's like a really strong, that's a really long, hard road. And I have a lot of admiration for the people doing that work. But I think we have to keep that. We have to keep that in our universe of what we're doing. Now, how do we house those things? Is maybe my dream is that we have like a TJ center and there's like a space for survivors and a space for people who cause harm. And should those people be in the same space? I don't know. In some cases, definitely not, right? But I think that we still have to, even if we're not putting them geographically in the same space, we need to hold that often they're in the same community and they're connected. So they're still influencing each other's lives, and that's like a reality that we have to live with. And we can actually leverage social connection to make change instead of like the carceral cutting and separating, right? Social connection can be the method, it can be the goal of the work that we're trying to do of transformative justice.
Absolutely. And transformative justice, like we said right from the beginning of this conversation, it's so many different things. Transformative and creative justice work is work with harm doers, it's work with community. We've had loads of people asking about, like, what do we do when there's no clear community? And I'm conscious of time, otherwise I'd put this out to you three wonderful people to answer, but there's lots and lots of projects that do beautiful work around how we do work with people where there's no community, and how we do work in building community, which is transformative in and of itself, and does a lot to deroot those harmful and oppressive systems of power. And all of those resources will be shared with you all of the participants who've attended today, to name and raise up just a few, like Generation 5, who do some amazing work and have a really comprehensive resource, creative interventions toolkit, who also have, again, like a very long, I think it's about 400-page document of how we do this really deep community building work and transformative justice on all of these different levels. Obviously Insight, who've been mentioned already, in the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, who have like so many resources on their website. But I'm again like conscious that we said to everybody on this call that we would be finishing at 2, and whilst I think that we could probably continue to talk for a lot longer, and I've just been so honoured and grateful to all of you, and to Avia, who wasn't able to be with us to the end of the call, for all of your like beautiful insights. And I'm wondering if there's a final thing, putting you on the spot here, that you'd like to share with people before we say goodbye to them all today. I have a final thing that we need to be sharing before we say goodbye, but are there any final things from any of you that you'd like to leave us with? I know, on the spot.
Maybe, you know, like taking our imagination seriously, you know, how, you know, and what we think is possible, and not sort of curbing that because of, you know, what we think the limits are within the state of, you know, of keeping those dreams and working towards those, because actually, you know, the work that we do now, the action that happens now, is what actually creates a transformation later. So yeah, take our imaginations and our dreams for a more collective, creative society seriously. It's important.
Thank you, Camilla.
Yeah, I would just say the same. And what I have even got out of this conversation, which I found like I've been really I've learned so much and really humbled to be here, and it's just been great. Thank you. Is oh yeah, remember when like there was a world before austerity, and like before the hostile environment, and like even the criminal justice system. Can you imagine before that? Like we actually can imagine all those things, and I am used, I guess, to imagining them when I'm doing my creative writing, which is just between me and the page. But like actually, I don't even take that imagination always when I'm sitting in these board meetings being like, there's no money, it's awful. So thank you to everyone in this discussion for that.
Thank you. I just muted myself and then was like, oh, I have to say something else. So before, I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see some slides? Yeah, great. So this is just to go back to the request from Aisha Gill about that those funds that are being called for to crowdfund to raise further funds in light of COVID and an RPF. And then here are the upcoming webinars for not the following month, for November. So I'll leave these on the screen. But thank you so much to everybody for coming, for joining us, for hopefully leaning into some of the discomfort, and just for being part of this conversation, either through the chat, but also more specifically to Camilla, Yara, Melanie, and Avia. It's been just so wonderful to be in space with you all, even if that space is virtual. And oh, I think there's also, please, yeah, there's a survey for people to fill out, which I will send through with the resources that will either come to you. I think I'll try and get them all to you tomorrow. Resources from everything that people have said in this call today, but also some additional resources as well. So thank you so much, everyone. And